Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the financial agreement holding your entire economy together, silently, invisibly for 50 years, had quietly been torn up overnight. No declaration, no war, no crisis headline, just a decision made in Riyadh without asking Washington. That morning is closer than you think. And when it comes, and the evidence suggests it is no longer a question of if, but when, the ripple effect will touch every mortgage payment, every grocery bill, every retirement account, and every dollar bill in every wallet in America. Most people have never heard of the petrodollar system. That is not an accident, because the petrodollar is the single most important financial arrangement in modern history, and the less ordinary people understand it, the more smoothly it serves the interests of those who built it. Here is the story they never taught you in school. It is 1974. America is reeling. The 1973 oil embargo has exposed a terrifying vulnerability. The world's largest economy can be brought to its knees by a group of desert nations controlling a commodity it cannot live without. Richard Nixon's Treasury Secretary flies to Riyadh for a secret meeting with the Saudi royal family. The deal they struck in that meeting has shaped every aspect of your financial life ever since. America would guarantee Saudi military protection and political support. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would price all of its oil exclusively in US dollars and would pressure every other OPEC nation to do the same. Every country on Earth that needed oil, which meant every country on Earth, would need to acquire dollars first. Demand for dollars became permanently, structurally, artificially enormous, and America could print money at a scale no other nation in history had ever attempted because the world had no choice but to absorb it. That was the deal, and for 50 years it held. But something changed in 2023 that the mainstream financial media covered for exactly one news cycle before moving on. Saudi Arabia publicly stated it was open to trading oil in currencies other than the dollar. One sentence, buried in a financial newswire, the quiet beginning of the end of the most powerful monetary arrangement in human history. To understand what breaks when the petrodollar ends, you first need to understand exactly what it built. Because this is not just about oil. It never was. The petrodollar system created something economists call, with remarkable understatement, an exorbitant privilege. Here is what that privilege actually means in practice. When America runs a deficit, when it spends more than it earns, it borrows money by issuing treasury bonds. Under normal economic rules, a country that borrows too much sees its currency weaken, its interest rates rise, and eventually its creditors lose confidence. That is what happens to every other country on Earth. It is not what happens to America. Because the petrodollar system means that every oil-importing nation must constantly accumulate dollars, and those dollars must be parked somewhere, and the safest, most liquid place to park dollars has always been U.S. Treasury bonds, which means the world's nations are effectively forced to lend America money at low interest rates forever, simply because they need oil, and oil costs dollars. America has borrowed approximately $33 trillion on the back of this arrangement. Think about that number. 33 trillion, a stack of $1,000 bills reaching from Earth to the moon and back 17 times. That debt exists because the world had no choice but to fund it. Now ask yourself what happens to that arrangement the moment Saudi Arabia prices a barrel of oil in Chinese yuan, or Indian rupees, or BRICS basket currency, or gold. The answer is not complicated, it's just uncomfortable. If oil buyers no longer need dollars to buy oil, they stop accumulating dollars. If they stop accumulating dollars, they stop buying treasury bonds. If they stop buying treasury bonds, America must offer higher interest rates to attract buyers. Higher interest rates mean higher mortgage rates, higher car loan rates, higher credit card rates, higher business borrowing costs. The era of cheap money that defined the post-2008 economy ends, not temporarily, but structurally. This is not speculation. This is arithmetic, and the arithmetic has already begun. In 2023, China and Saudi Arabia completed their first oil trades settled in Chinese yuan. It was a test, a small one, carefully watched by every central bank on the planet. It worked perfectly, and the nations watching took careful notes. But the full story of who is moving, how fast, and what specific trigger will accelerate everything, that is where this gets truly alarming. This is the part the financial mainstream refuses to cover honestly, because covering it honestly requires admitting that the process is already underway, not starting, not theoretical, already underway. Let's map exactly who is moving and how fast. China has been the most aggressive and the most patient simultaneously. For a decade, Beijing has been building the infrastructure of a cross-border interbank payment system known as CIPS, which is a direct competitor to the SWIFT dollar messaging network. As of 2024, CIPS processes over $4 trillion equivalent in transactions annually. In 2015, it processed almost nothing. Russia was effectively expelled from the dollar system in sanctions in 2022. What happened next surprised Western economists. Russia did not collapse, it pivoted. Today, Russia prices the majority of its energy exports in rubles, yuan, and rupees. The forced experiment that Washington intended as punishment became a working proof of concept for de-dollarization. India, the world's third-largest oil importer, has been quietly negotiating bilateral oil trade agreements with Russia, Saudi Arabia, and UAE that bypass dollar settlement entirely. India's finance ministry has explicitly stated that reducing dollar dependency is a national strategic priority. Saudi Arabia itself has now joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a dialogue partner, signed a landmark diplomatic agreement with Iran brokered by China, and publicly discussed pricing oil in multiple currencies at least 4 separate times since 2022. And then there's BRICS. In 2023, the BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, expanded to include Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia. The combined GDP of the expanded BRICS bloc now rivals the G7. The combined oil production of BRICS members controls over 40% of global supply. They have announced publicly that a BRICS trade currency, backed partially by gold and partially by a commodity basket, is under active development. This is not a fringe movement. This is a coalition of nations representing more than half the world's population, moving deliberately and systematically away from dollar dependency. And the speed of that movement has one specific accelerant that nobody in Washington wants to discuss publicly. An accelerant that was entirely self-inflicted. In February 2022, the United States and its allies made a decision that will be studied by economic historians for centuries. They froze Russia's foreign currency reserves, approximately $300 billion held in Western financial institutions, simply immobilized, seized, without a court order, by executive decision. It was intended as the ultimate financial weapon. It became the ultimate advertisement for de-dollarization. Because every nation on Earth that held dollar reserves, and that is essentially every nation on Earth, watched what happened and asked themselves one question. If they did it to Russia, could they do it to us? The answer, legally and practically, was yes. And from that moment, the motivation to reduce dollar reserve holdings stopped being merely economic and became existential. You cannot weaponize a reserve currency and expect the world to keep treating it as a neutral store of value. That single decision accelerated the de-dollarization timeline by an estimated decade. Now let's talk about the 5 ripple effects that hit ordinary Americans when the petrodollar fractures, because this is where the abstract becomes personal. Ripple 1. Import price inflation becomes permanent. When dollar demand falls, the dollar weakens. When the dollar weakens, everything America imports becomes more expensive. America imports, among other things, most of its consumer electronics, most of its clothing, significant portions of its food supply, and virtually all of its rare earth materials. A 20% dollar depreciation means a 20% price increase on a vast range of everyday goods, permanently. Ripple 2. Interest rates cannot come back down. As foreign demand for treasury bonds shrinks, America must offer higher yields to attract buyers. Higher yields mean higher mortgage rates, higher car loan rates, higher credit card rates, higher business borrowing costs. The era of cheap money that defined the post-2008 economy ends, not temporarily, but structurally. Ripple 3, the U.S. military footprint becomes unaffordable. America's ability to project military power globally has been funded in significant part by the exorbitant privilege of cheap borrowing. As that privilege erodes, the cost of maintaining 800 military bases in 70 countries becomes a direct domestic budget choice. Other programs must be cut to compensate. Ripple 4, social spending faces existential pressure. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, programs that 70 million Americans depend on, are funded by a government that has borrowed freely for 50 years. As borrowing becomes expensive, the math of those programs changes dramatically. Ripple 5, the most immediate and the most personal, hits in a place nobody is prepared for. Ripple 5 is the one that arrives first, before the interest rates fully adjust, before the import prices fully reprice, before the government budget crisis becomes impossible to ignore. Ripple 5 is confidence. Not economic confidence, not investor confidence, ordinary human confidence in the purchasing power of the money in your pocket. Here is how it happens. The petrodollar system works, has always worked, not primarily because of legal frameworks or military enforcement. It works because of a collective belief, a global consensus that the dollar is the safest, most reliable, most universally accepted store of value on Earth. That belief is self-reinforcing as long as it is universal. The moment it stops being universal, the moment a critical mass of nations begins treating the dollar as one option among several rather than the only option, the belief begins to unravel. And belief, in monetary systems, is everything. The dollar is not backed by gold. It is not backed by oil, not anymore. It is backed by the collective faith of 8 billion people that it will be worth roughly what it is worth today when they spend it tomorrow. History is littered with currencies that lost that faith. The Reichmark, the Zimbabwean dollar, the Venezuelan bolivar, the Roman denarius. None of them failed because of a single dramatic event. They failed because confidence eroded, slowly at first, then all at once. So what do you actually do? Here is the framework that financial historians consistently identify as the approach that preserved wealth through every previous reserve currency transition in modern history. First, reduce exposure to long-duration dollar-denominated assets. Long-term bonds, fixed-rate savings products, and cash-heavy portfolios are the most vulnerable to dollar depreciation. Second, increase exposure to assets that hold value across currency regimes. Physical gold has survived every reserve currency transition in history. Productive land produces real value regardless of what currency denominates it. Commodities, energy, agriculture, base metals reprice upward when the dollar weakens. Third, understand that this is not a binary event. The dollar will not be replaced overnight. The transition will take years, possibly a decade or more. But the time to position is before the transition accelerates, not after it becomes obvious. Fourth, pay attention to what serious institutional money is doing, not what it is saying. The gap between the public statements of major financial institutions and their actual portfolio positioning on dollar exposure is currently the largest it has been in 30 years. They are saying the dollar is fine. They are doing, quietly diversifying away from it. Here is the final thought. Every reserve currency in history has eventually been replaced. The Spanish real, the Dutch guilder, the British pound sterling, each one dominated global trade for a century or more. Each one was eventually displaced, not by war or political decision, but by the slow, inevitable arithmetic of economic gravity. The dollar has dominated for 80 years. The question is not whether it will be displaced. The question is whether you will be positioned for the world that comes after. The Saudi decision to accept yuan for oil is not the end. It is the first sentence of a very long final chapter. Subscribe and follow this channel, because as this story develops, and it will develop faster than almost anyone in the mainstream is acknowledging, you will want to have been paying attention from the beginning. The ripples have already started. Most people will feel them only when they become waves.